Radical Conservatism Continued. I literally have broken every bone in my body plastering. I've used to making a couple of $100,000 a year my whole adult life. When it came home from Wall Street, I realized that the exploitation of legal labor was white-collar crime. Neo-ignorant homeowners tricked themselves into believing was somehow all right. Kind of like the yellow ribbons. White-collar crime was not just legal now, it was encouraged. I had to outwork 10 men. I used to say it all the time. I was fine outworking 10 guys. You know, I wasn't going to live on no $10, $20 an hour. I needed to make 80. I had girls to raise. I had children to raise in a contemporary fashion. I was fine outworking 10. But when I got to 15 and 20, I had to start taking chances. And I took some chances, and the guy didn't spike the roof in. I spiked it, and it was a thing this way, and I leaned on the gutter, and I fell. 33 feet on, you know, the ETMs were right next door, and they saved my life. Spit through all the way through my tongue, crushed my face, broke my back. I had to make $80 an hour to stay alive. Raising my young daughters was supported, was very happy, and all my fun life I had knocked in Utah and Nevada lifestyle. I had my whole life. I wasn't going to give that up. I literally had to outwork 10 men. I was very happy and prosperous. So I took chances. I was okay when I just had to outwork 10. Then it just fine. It was like the Adam Smith School of Economics. I became so skilled I was in demand, which it was very high demand, my whole adult life in regard to the plaster trade. I'm the last, right there in that building. I redid all the lath and plaster in theirs, in those buildings. In the summertime, the Japanese girls would come in here. And the dorms, and they would only go from the campus back and forth. I left my wallet right there on one of the bathrooms in there, had $3,000 in it. Couldn't find it, went down the next day, it was still sitting there. And them girls were in and out of the bathroom. They didn't touch it. I can, to this day, do things with a hawk and trowel that would blow people's minds. I can go. I'll show you videos if you don't believe me. And ask anybody in these trades, oh, can I? I did the brownie ceiling acoustic lath and plaster. I restored the Penman house. I built the tree out of lath plaster in the Ogden Museum. I've done so much lath and plaster artistic work with that hawk and trowels. I love that trade. I have a secret recipe. I call the secret sauce. Jerry, my lifelong hot tender, loves to tell me, with the secret sauce of yours, why don't you build yourself a new truck instead of that old piece of shit Cadillac you drive? I used to drive I was plastering out of my old Cadillac there for a while. That's a whole nother story. It's funny. I was the only game in town in regard to real stucco and authentic lath and plaster. I knew how. I had paid my dues. I started plastering in the old timers in 1976 at 16 years old. The old plasters were very intimidating and downright mean, but I grew up with a digger on the family ranch, working like a dog from birth. Digger, my dad. That's what everybody called him because he used to raise potatoes. Potato diggers, make us sack potatoes. From birth, with him barking at me like I was his own personal platoon, and he was the drill sergeant, which he was an ex-drill sergeant from Pendleton, an ex-Marine from Pendleton, nuked to death. I loved every minute of it. I loved was his hard physical labor. I still love physical hard labor to this day. The sun on my back, with the sweat running down my muscles, aching, and a piece of art I have created from the sand and the clay of the earth with my hawk and trowel, wheelbarrow, and hoe. You will never see power tools on one of my jobs. People used to say, "Where's your mixer?" I would just point to the mullet boy, Giacomo boy, as I used to call him, Jerry, as I called him. Longest mullet in world history. This guy still has it. Like Leonardo's Gian Giacomo, Jerry was a thief, but I kept him around. But unlike Freud's take, which is more likely true, Jerry, I do not think, was gay. And say he is standing right here. That piece of art I have created, it makes me, my endorphins open more than sex. And I am not kidding. That hawk and trowel in that sun with it coming off me, looking at me, was so sexual to me for so long. So I dangled from the roof with the climbing gear and the chisel and the hardwire and the hammer in one hand. By myself, the old way, chiseled every square inch of 4 layers off 103 years of ignorance of the great Hodson stone building. I had trouble sleeping at night, my arms ached. I just kept in my mind Leslie Hodson and Mary Eccles the whole time as the artistic aspect of the great past. At the artist is number one always, with any good artist's brain. While I was doing it in my hot tender, Jerry, the Giacomo, who had gotten lazy and fat over the past day, stood on the ground and directed foot traffic, fresh out of prison for dope. He said, "You know the whole town is rooting for you to fail. If you fell on this one, you will never you'll have to leave this town. He was not kidding. That it was contemporized Utah had turned into the nail that sticks up, hammer it down, and I had stuck up in Ogden for decades. The owner who said it to Randy and Bernie would walk by every day. The neo-ignorant man who tried to destroy it. He did not say a word to me. He knew. He would walk by, this creep that destroyed it. He would walk by every day. He'd just look at me. He knew I'd rip his head off. I wanted to. And Jerry would give him shit. I would snap. He knew I would snap if he said one word to me. I fully disguised the rape of that great piece of art and their ignorant excuses of it cannot be saved. It made me sick. After the building was naked, he said to me walking by one day, "You know all those pits in the sandstone cannot be saved. Why do you think they covered it in the first place?" He was right. I snapped. I went one of my greatest rants of all time. My Mayor Eccles' historical, ignorant neocons are destroying this country rants. Oh, did I go off in his face. He ran away. Their Eccles history ignorant neo rants was a very old, there was a very old alcoholic attorney standing there while I went on my rant. He would come by every day. He was an old prominent attorney who turned into an alky, and he'd come by and talk to me. I loved him. I loved him. And talk to me. He repeated the exact same thing. Many did. Many would say, that is why they did it in the first place. You're never going to be able to save this. I would think to myself, shut the fuck up with all your uneducated critiques. They're great if they are fully educated in regard to the art. I'm all for critiques because I used to paint my art right on the wall right there. And I'm all for, you know, these great art professors up here critique me. I listen to them, but people that critique me who don't know subject matter, as Pollock said when they told him it's hideous, it looks like just splashing and dripping like a little kid. There's no end, there's no beginning. He said, thank you for the compliment, you ignorant morons. Subject matter. Critiques by neo-ignorant morons are a blotter test exposing their low intelligence, their personal battle with themselves in regard to their being a moron. He was a very old World War II attorney. He was no moron. Every attorney in Ogden passes by there every day because the public defender's office is right next door. How many times this asshole comes out? He knows I'm out here. I talk to him. Fucking cunt. Next door. And that, like a mini military industrial complex, has evolved into Ogden as its #1 industry. Ogden, gonzo. Federal government, oh, we hate it. Rob Bishop's our congressman. He's a piece of shit. He's done anything. We hate the it's teabagger heaven when the #1 employer is the federal government. Everyone works for the federal government here. We have Hillfield, we have RS, the university, it's all government. Repressing the working class, replacing them with brown, hungry slaves from the southern borders and working class sisters. So they are destroyed and turned to the cheap drug for escape meth. And then they put them on probation for life. That's the game they play here. They repress these guys, these construction workers like you just let me. They take their jobs and replace them with cash. They're exploiting the hungry people of the South, and then these guys turn to drugs and repress them. Then they put them on probation for life. It is the industry right here, right there where I'm talking about, where they tore down the old Orpheum Theater. Now is the adult probation and parole, the #1 business right there. What a metaphor that is. I'll get some footage of it. That's right exactly where John Brownie's shop was, where he invented the machine gun, right there. Where the Orpheum Theater was, right there. Where the Masonic Temple is still there that I saved. Right there is now adult probation and parole. They put these guys on probation for life here. They never let them off. It's just it's an income stream. It is a major industry in America. None of them can afford an attorney, so the state, you know, they throw a public defender, make a plea, because none of them can afford an attorney. And the attorney trade and evolved to the state. The old attorney said to me, Kevin, he was an old friend of my D-Day Uncle Harold, who everyone in Ogden knew. My Uncle Harold was something else. Out on the bulge, D-Day, postmaster, big, womanizing, incredible guy. Harold, but he's still alive. He lives up in Ontario, and he's about 90. He's still chasing 900 girls, I understand. Got pissed off in 97, tried to choke his ex-wife's attorney to death, and he moved to Oregon. I'll never forget, he was going through a divorce. He got in the elevator with the attorney. Told him, you know, and went off on his, D-Day rant. Told him, I'll just plain kill you, rip your fucking head off. And the guy withdrew from the case the next day. The attorney, another prominent old guy from here, Stephen Farr, he'll talk about it. I think he's dead now. Jerry Jocko said the old attorney and are the only two roofie. They're the only two. Jerry, my Giacomo said, the old attorney and I are the only two rooting for you, Kevin. Maybe Mariner Leslie from afar. They're rooting for you. I would call Jerry my Giacomo in those days. He had worked for me for as long as I can remember. Giacomo, Leonardo's assistant, was his much younger life partner. Jerry and I neither gay. I don't think so anyway. Giacomo was, you know, was Leonardo's assistant. You know, he was, you know, we can get into a whole talk about it. Even if he was not gay for him, Jerry was the guy who kept the mullet the whole time. The old attorney said, Kevin, you showed everyone you still can outwork them. That was me stripping. He's like, boy, you outworked that. You stripped it all by yourself with an axe. Let's see the skill now. This is a poem I wrote while I was doing the restoration of the old temple. It's called The Old Attorney. I love this. As a boy, I loved to read about art, history. Michelangelo. Read what he said about plaster. He said they were the most refined, skilled artists on earth. Diego Rivera, Leonardo, Mackintosh, Mallet. I loved them all, and they loved plasters. They were plasters. Diego Rivera, Michelangelo would both roll over if they could see what people call frescoes or Venetian plaster. Mackintosh would freak out if he could see them calling paint over foam EFA stucco. Mallet and all the great masters would cry if they could see what this country has done to skilled craftsmen and their families. They have been destroyed from the top to bottom, from A to Z, every aspect of their lives crushed. It is pathetic commentary on us as a people. I recently have been restoring the 1905 Maseno Temple in our town. Hodson was the architect, one of the greatest Art Deco architects in world history. It was the first major project of his. Arched real frescoes in the ceilings, huge spans, 40 by 40, 2 of them. Mariner Eccles' office was in that building, one of the most historical places in the history of this country, 25th Street, USA. Some loser contractors tore the frescoes out. I begged the city and the owners for decades to restore it. They condemned it. Thank God 2 men with souls stepped in and bought it, Randy Richards and Bernie Allen. After listening to me, Randy, for years, they let me restore it. No one thought I could put it back to its original status. I am getting older, and I had recovered from a critical fall, broken critical condition. I will not be able to just supervise. I knew I had to do every square inch myself, and it would take all of my skill and knowledge. I rappelled 60 feet with a climbing rope and a rig. I had hand chiseled every square inch while getting dumped on by hundreds of pigeons. I had trouble sleeping at night because of my arms aching from the chisel. 4 layers of bad plaster over 103 years. The building is next to the public defender's office, so every know-it-all, never worked a day in their life attorney would tell me, you are wasting your time. I think Bernie and Randy were halfway in that camp. After months of chiseling, it was naked. A very old attorney, 80-something years old, when I had known for years, came by one day and said, Kevin, you know that's why they plastered over the first time. The sandstone was spalling and crumbling. I had been watching with great interest the whole time. Now we will see if you are the artist you say you are. You showed us you know how to work. Now let's see the craft. He was right. I had a sign that I made that said, I am doing the work Americans do not want to do from the ground up, not because it is easy, because it is hard. I knew I would get a lot of negative feedback. That is what I was asking for. Jerry said, Kevin, if you do not pull this one off, after all your ranting and raving you have done, you better pack up and leave town. Everyone is looking for you to fell, except the old attorney, Hodson, and the owners. Boy, was he right. This job was more about vindication of me as my choice to stand alone as a metaphorical plastering matter. I had lost everything standing on my principles. My money was gone, my life was gone, my health was almost gone. But I still had integrity and strength. I would tell everyone to, your money cannot buy you what I have, integrity and strength. I played with my plaster mix. I kept remembering what my old mentor would say every day for 30 years. You might be getting close. You will not be getting close until you have your own recipes. You will never be a great plaster until you have your own recipes. Jerry Swande, you know you have been using your own recipe for years, and even I don't know what your tricks are. But you will have to come up with one recipe on this one. Jerry knows sometimes it takes me dozens of mixes to get where I need to go. When it comes to restoration projects, the first mix, that was it. It's the only time it's ever happened to me. I mix my plaster to match stone, so it is just like stone. I grind the materials. I take the same materials that nature made that stone, and I will make it out of it to match exactly. I did it on the first one on this. Leslie and Metzi were looking out for me. I thought about this job for decades. I'd watched it being covered up for over for 4 times. I remembered it from the 60s, next door to the Grand Orpheum Theater, tore down by losers. I had driven by it every day for 35 years on my way to Morris Hanson's supply yard. When I started going there, they still sold animal blood for glue and horse bags of hair for fiber. Not to mention wire lath hangers. I still have some of them. I do know how to use them and have used them. I would mix my own at home. I would be questioned every day by dozens wannabe know-nothing what it was made with. I would say, you don't know, do you? And you probably will never know. I sculpted it in some cases over a foot deep. All kinds of scroll work with a trowel. I had a photograph Randy at the baker inside the building had found for me to work from. It was from the United States Historical World War I archives. It had been taken right across the street during the 1918 parade. I looked at it for about an hour every day, sitting in the snow basin first chairlifts in Utah. I have 2 in my yard. Randy restored them, Richards, and they're in there. I would sit there and review that and meditate about that photograph for an hour or 2 every morning. For 2 months I sculpted the plaster. I was almost done and the old attorney came by and said, "Kev, I need to talk to you." Okay, I said, "What is it?" He said, "Do not ever let anyone in this town ever slander you again. You are the artist. It had been tried 4 times over 100 years by some great plasters and not so great plasters. You are the only one that got it right, and don't ever forget it." I had not shed a tear for a long while. All the ugly pain I was raging I had gone through over the past decade. The last tear I had cried was when they zipped my father's body in the body bag. Semper Fi, the old attorney, gave me a hug. I don't think he was the hugging type, nor am I. He was hit by a car and killed 2 months later, right in front of the old Masonic temple. I never forget him, or I always never forget him, and I always knew. Always, the plastering was the great metaphorical art realism, and to all you beaten down 50 or 60 or 70 something craftsmen, you have something they do not and can never buy, steal, or scam, a soul embedded with integrity. The old attorney said so. As Eccles and FDR formulated their plan, it was one of compassion for all men, unlike today's Ayn Rand fakers. You do realize are the Fed policy completely devised as a Scientology is devised from a science fiction writer, for real. This is no joke, no offense to Scientologists. I do not know anything about the truth. The great fake of all time in regard to monetary spoils of the world is Ayn Rand nutcase. She grew up in Lenin, Russia. Anyone who does not understand that that means to grow up in Lenin, Russia is a total clueless of any history. Russia lost 20 million men in the Second Great War of Europe alone. All of the men, they were all dead right here. The Browning machine gun. Greenspan and Bernanke and the so-called student of the Great Depression, what a fraud crock of shit that is. I have heard this read and him say that Eccles and FDR's policies failed. Are you a fucking neo-ignorant kitty? This is coming from the 2 biggest failures in world economic history, calling FDR and Eccles failure. All they did was create the strongest middle class in world history. Facts, FDR was the most beloved president in United States history. Eccles was the most accomplished economist in the history of the United States, standing in reality right next to Hamilton. All Paul's did was create the greatest middle class in U.S. history and world history. What has to be science fiction, radical conservative accomplishments have they accomplished? I will tell you what they have accomplished. The total destruction of the United States as an economic powerhouse. Under the rule, they crushed us. I will lay it in very detailed style on the fact that 80% of the United States wealth has been destroyed under the 2 fakes over the last 10, 15, 20 years. One day while in Lower Manhattan, I decided to walk over to Alexander Hamilton's grave, the first Secretary of the Treasury, of the great American economist. Remember what he was shot to death in a duel by the Nartho Pretty Boy. Hamilton was influenced by any man in the path of America's powers. Remember, it was Hamilton, the orphan from the Buccaneers, the George Washington student, his pseudo-child. He said to Jefferson, "It is naive to think our borders will not be attacked, our vast natural resources. We must have a central bank and ability to fund a militia to fight off such attacks." He urged for a strong financial system with little debt, so he could use our grade A rating, the world's financial community, to obtain funding if we needed it to defend. His hypothesis came true. We had France, yes, all of you France haters, that supported us in the money many times in our history. We were able to fund and defend this land from Hitler's massive machine via Hamilton's policies, Mariner's policies of a strong federal centralized bank with the ability to borrow. Not now. I walked over to the exchange of the Trinity Church right next to the towers. I knew he was buried there. I knew he was only 47 at the time he was shot and killed by Burr. I asked everyone, no one knew. Finally, I walked over to the giant building next to the New York Stock Exchange where the Bible that Washington's hand was on the first inauguration, not the copy of the Quran that Jefferson has translated and owned. And he owned a lot of religious books, more neo-ignorance. I asked the park rangers who dress in colony dress. The ranger knew. He said, it is one of the left side, and he walked over to the front of the church. It is the white marker with the pyramid shape. I walked over and took a few photos back to my book, on the cover of my book. I thought a lot to this day about Hamilton and Eckers and Volcker and Greenspan. I thought to myself, has it really come to this? These great men giving their lives in honor, millions of our country's historical and economic policy rooted in radical science fiction. A society of neo-ignorant, the leaders, let alone the masses, have no clue of the reality of this country's amazing history and absolutely no respect for the truth. Make up the history. Fact learning, that's hard work. Change history, won't work. That's the end of that chapter, but I wanted to read that chapter in regard to the Freednickers. And my last chapter in this book is Freednickers and Masons. And I want this to be clear as I prove this. This is Freednickers, not Freednickers, not the German word for freethinkers. This is the word for fleeing impoverished conditions. It was a secret society that met in the Wattis's houses and the Browning house and the Eccles house, and they met down there. And the community used to call them free drinkers. And I got in an argument with a guy one time at a BYU store, and he says, oh, they were nobodies and nothing. Well, Mariner Wright in his book on page 85 calls out who they were. My grandpa, Abraham Hunsaker IV, well, his father was one of them. I come from a very infamous bloodline. Mariner knew me personally. As when I watched right here in this building, as I shook Bobby Kennedy's hand in 1960, I was sitting with my great uncle, who personally knew Mariner. Mariner used to put his hand on my head, call me one of the little Danish twins. He was an incredible man. And it all rooted from here. It was him who started the CCC, the WPA, the Federal Reserve, the greatest middle class in history. It was his economic policy, and these men that were in the secret society, Abe Glassman, Mr. Hinckley, Robert Hinckley, a powerhouse. I mean, I can go over the who's, and I will name this list, but I found things as I was doing work, and I've researched, and I really dig into Bernard DeVoto, lived right there, the dean at Harvard, the Harper Mag, that's him, right here. I really dig in, and Fawn McKay, which is David O'Kay's niece, who wrote Jefferson's biography, who taught right here, who went to my high school, who her name doesn't even get dare spoken, who's the most accomplished person to ever walk out of this county. Her brilliant genius, incredible mind. I have autographed books from her. I knew her personally. I knew Mariner personally. And I have found it appalling for all these years that he does not get the credit. He was the great socialist. He created the strongest middle class in the history of the world right here in this town. And the Freednickers is where this was born. It was born through that secret society, which was more powerful than Masons in Lodge 18 in that 1905 Leslie Hodgson. And I will prove it. I will prove it. I will prove it, and I can prove it in my book, The Ballad of Cement, which is done. And I had that book finished before I got leukemia. I didn't know. Right as I got it done, as my PhD, it was done. It was broad. It was beautiful. I loved it. It was so. I researched it for decades. As I finished that book, as you guys know my path, I got leukemia. As I rant and raved and carried on about Fukushima giving us leukemia, and I got it. And I've been fighting for my life. Well, I've been rewriting it right now, and I've got it pretty well done. I've been reading my post-ignorance online. But that's what laying the foundation for this is. I'm going to give credit where credit due. And this has never been exposed before. And this is not going to be commentary. This is going to be documentary. It's extremely well researched. I will prove this economic powerhouse of this town. As these people came from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland. They came from Switzerland. As my great-grandfather knew Einstein personally. They came from the same village. And I will prove all this. And I will embed it and talk about the secret society they had. The Freednickers. As they met in Lodge 18. FDR himself, Mariner Eccles were like this right here as they hatched the WPA, the CCC, the restructured the Federal Reserve. The IMF was invented here. The World Bank was invented here. 16 of these, this whole philosophy as it was kidnapped by Greenspan, and it was his nephew that was in line to grip Greenspan's of District 12. As he was head of district, it was his nephew Spencer who was in line. And Reagan gave it to the great Ayn Rander, and Mariner was completely the opposite. He would roll over. There's the problem. That is the day that this all fell apart. The day that the progressive idealism of the Federal Reserve, which created a powerhouse, the great socialist. I have an autographed copy of his book. I will count these names in detail. I will tell you where they met, when they met, how they met, what days. I will show you writings of how they hatched this. I will prove this. This, like I said, this is what I've been up to the whole time. When I do my videos in that backdrop that's in the mountain, back of the mountain, there's a reason I use that. That is Ben Lomond Peak, named by the Eccles. And I waited for this thing to be torn down because of the huge significance of this university, of the promontory towers, of this, and it's ironic that a relative of the McKays is tearing it down, and the powerhouse of David O. McKay, who was the president of the Mormon Church in the 60s, his eyes boy in his iconic white coat. He was a progressive, he was a liberal. He and Mariner were like this. As Mariner lived in the Hotel Utah at the end of his life, I knew him very personally. Both my grandpas were in this secret society, and they all drive Dodges. They wouldn't drive anything because Mr. Hinckley's dealership, and I got a really great photo of it, 1915, as they're tearing it down at the same time as this. One of the McKays tearing it down. I looked down and I said, "You got to be McKay." You look just like, yeah. I says, "How ironic. I just had that conversation. You tearing this down. We had this big, long talk." Pretty amazing. It is amazing. As Fawn taught here. What a... I don't know if any of you have ever read her biography, or her of Jefferson, her work on Nixon. She is the... Her and Bernard DeVoto, as they both wrote anti-Mormon books, as Fawn was let into the archives, and she wrote, you know, the Joseph Smith, No Man Knows My Path, which is an incredible book, by the way. It is incredible, and she was incredible, absolutely incredible. As John Lennon was killed, as I laid right over there with my first girlfriend on Brinker at Eccles Avenue, on 15th and Eccles I lived. The night he died was the night my oldest daughter, who just happens to live right by the Dakota, the artist herself, was conceived that night. Well, Fawn died just a few days later. About a month later, right there by where I was at, as she had so many ties. I knew her. I knew her personally. Our family, she was incredible. She was incredible. She was so brilliant. As she was a professor here before she married Brody and went to the University of Chicago and UCLA. It all comes full circle, and I'm going to prove all this and lay it out. I'm going to give credit where credit's due. To Fawn McKay, to Bernard DeVoto, to Mariner Eccles, and I'm going to expose that the Brownies were selling to the Germans, both sides, for the whole time, because they don't want to talk about that. And I will prove how these Mormon immigrants in 30 years become the most influential powerhouses, from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland, from the slums of Nottingham, England, from the slums of Germany, to the most vast economic powers in world history. The most powerful minds, the most powerful resources that incorporated and changed this world so dramatically right here. I will prove it. Kevin Blanch.